July 12, 1971. 0520 hours. A concrete watchtower overlooking Petropavlovsk Naval Base, Kamchatka Peninsula. The morning fog rolled off the Avacha Bay like wet wool. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov stamped his boots against the cold, breath visible in the pale Arctic dawn. Below him, 23 Soviet submarines sat at their moorings. Typhoons, Victors, Yankees, the pride of the Pacific Fleet. The tea in his thermos had gone cold 2 hours ago. Volkov swept his binoculars across the bay for the 100th time that shift. Same gray water, same rocking hulls, same gulls picking at garbage near the docks. The sonar buoys showed nothing. The underwater sensor nets showed nothing. The patrol boats had reported nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except. Volkov lowered his binoculars, picked up the logbook, flipped back 3 pages to Lieutenant Bereshkov's entry from 72 hours prior. He'd noted something odd. A pressure variation on the outer hydrophones. Probably a whale, he'd written. False alarm. Stand down. Then 2 pages back. Different officer. Different shift. Another anomaly. Temperature fluctuation near buoy line 7, attributed to current changes. Then 5 days before that. Volkov felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the Kamchatka wind. 7 anomalies in 2 weeks. All different. All explained away. All exactly the kind of nothing that added up to something. He reached for the phone to call the base commander. 300 yards away, 70 meters below the surface, the USS Gato sat absolutely motionless in the thermocline layer, her cameras clicking steadily through a periscope that looked like a piece of drifting kelp. But before we go further, drop a comment telling us what state or country you're watching from and what time it is right now. We're curious where our viewers are around the world. Or now ask yourself, what technology could make a 300-foot submarine invisible in enemy waters? And why didn't the Soviets see it coming? The phone call went up 3 levels before anyone took it seriously. Captain First Rank Konstantin Petrov listened to Volkov's theory with the patience of a man who'd heard 1,000 false alarms. Lieutenant, we have the most sophisticated submarine detection network in the Soviet Navy. If an American boat was in our harbor, we would know. Sir, the pattern is coincidence. Petrov cut him off. Do you know how many whales migrate through these waters? How many temperature layers shift with the currents? You're seeing ghosts. But Petrov wasn't stupid. After he hung up, he pulled the sonar logs himself. The anomalies were there. Faint, easily dismissed individually. But together, he called Moscow. At GRU headquarters, the report landed on a desk already buried in similar reports. Murmansk had logged unexplained signals. Polyarny had reported weird acoustic shadows. Vladivostok had found equipment malfunctions near their submarine pens. Different bases, different dates, same impossible conclusion. The Americans were getting inside Soviet territorial waters. Somehow. The analyst chain-smoked 3 cigarettes while reviewing the data. The math didn't work. American submarines were loud. The Los Angeles-class boats were faster than Soviet subs, sure, but they ran hot and noisy. You could hear them from 20 miles away on a good day. The older Sturgeon-class boats? Even worse. Built in the 60s. Nuclear reactors you could practically hear from shore. There was no way they were penetrating harbor defenses. Unless. He pulled out a file marked Holystone, an NSA intercept from 2 years prior. Some kind of American code word. Mentioned submarines. Mentioned reconnaissance. But the details were fragmentary, incomplete. The Americans called it special operations. The Soviets called it suicide. You don't drive a submarine into enemy harbors. Not if you want the crew to come home. Not if you care about starting World War III. The risk-reward made no sense, which meant either the Americans were insane or they'd solved a problem Soviet engineers thought was unsolvable. The analyst stubbed out his cigarette. Both options terrified him. The first rule of submarine warfare is simple. Don't get caught. The second rule is even simpler. If you're in enemy waters and they know you're there, you're already dead. Soviet doctrine assumed American submarines would never violate this rule. They'd lurk outside territorial waters. They'd monitor from safe distances. They'd run at the first sign of detection. They were wrong about everything. Between 1969 and 1975, American submarines conducted over 200 penetrations of Soviet territorial waters. They photographed submarine bases. They mapped harbor defenses. They recorded acoustic signatures of every Soviet sub in the fleet. They did it in Murmansk, in Polyarny, in Vladivostok, in Petropavlovsk. The Soviets knew none of this. What they knew was that something impossible was happening. In March 1972, a Sturgeon-class submarine actually collided with a Soviet submarine near Murmansk. The American boat escaped. The Soviet sub surfaced with a massive dent. The crew was told it was a training accident. The truth stayed buried. By 1973, GRU had 17 separate incidents they couldn't explain. Equipment that failed in patterns, hydrophones that went dead at specific times, sonar contacts that vanished like smoke. The Americans weren't just sneaking into Soviet waters, they were getting comfortable there. The technology that made it possible wasn't science fiction, it was engineering. The Sturgeon-class boats had been retrofitted with something the Soviets didn't have: sophisticated sound-dampening systems, special propellers, anechoic coating that absorbed sonar, and balls of steel commanders willing to sit absolutely still on the ocean floor for hours while patrol boats passed overhead. But the real secret weapon? Soviet arrogance. Moscow convinced itself that American submarine commanders would never risk their boats and crews on close-in reconnaissance. It was too dangerous, too aggressive, too likely to start a war. They forgot one critical fact about Americans. Give them a challenge that starts with, "You can't," and they'll spend $1 billion proving you wrong. The Pentagon called them spec ops boats. Officially, they didn't exist. Commander John Bradley sat in the wardroom of the USS Halibut, 400 feet below the Sea of Okhotsk, studying photographs of Soviet communications cables on the ocean floor. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago. Nobody moved to refill it. Outside the pressure hull, Soviet destroyers were conducting anti-submarine exercises. Right above them. Bradley's executive officer leaned in, whispered, "Skipper, they're pinging. Active sonar. They're looking for us." "How close?" "Half a mile. Moving in a search pattern." Bradley didn't blink. "Maintain silent running. They'll pass." This was the 4th time in 6 days they'd played dead while Soviet ships hunted overhead. The crew called it threading the needle. Bradley called it Tuesday. The Halibut wasn't a combat submarine. She was a spy, retrofitted with cameras, acoustic sensors, and a special projects compartment that officially didn't exist. Her mission wasn't to sink Soviet ships. It was to photograph them, map them, record them, and most importantly, tap their communications cables. The cables ran along the seafloor connecting Soviet naval bases, encrypted military traffic, fleet movements, launch orders. Everything Moscow transmitted to its Pacific submarines traveled through those cables. The Americans had found them, mapped them, and in one of the gutsiest intelligence operations of the Cold War, they'd attached recording devices directly to the cables. The Soviets never thought to look there. Why would they? The cables were in Soviet territorial waters, in harbors, in the middle of submarine bases. It would require an American submarine to penetrate harbor defenses, avoid detection, and work on the ocean floor for hours. Impossible. Except Bradley had done it. Twice. And he was about to do it again. Above them, the Soviet destroyer's sonar pinged once more. Then silence. Then the sound of propellers moving away. Bradley's executive officer exhaled slowly. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "Granted." "We're out of our minds." Bradley smiled for the first time in 6 days. "Yes, we are." Moscow, 1974. The classified briefing room smelled like stale tobacco and desperation. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov slammed the file folder onto the table. "Explain this." The room held 12 men. Naval intelligence, GRU analysts, submarine commanders. They all stared at the photographs spread across the conference table. Pictures of Soviet submarines, taken from periscope depth, inside Soviet harbors. Clear as day. The photographs had been recovered from a seized foreign journalist's apartment in Helsinki. The journalist was CIA. The photos were 3 months old, and they showed details of Soviet submarine construction that shouldn't exist outside of classified blueprints. "How?" Gorshkov's voice was ice. "How are they doing this?" Captain Second Rank Yevgeny Kozlov stood. He'd written the intelligence assessment. "Comrade Admiral, we believe they're using a new long-range optical system, telescopic lenses. They're photographing from outside territorial waters." "Impossible," another officer cut in. "The resolution is too high. These were taken from inside the harbor." "Then they have satellites. The angles are wrong. These are surface-level shots, periscope height." Silence fell over the room. An older engineer spoke carefully. What if they're actually inside our waters?" Everyone turned to stare at him. "The Americans drive submarines into our harbors?" Kozlov shook his head. "It violates every principle of submarine operations. The risk would be extraordinary," the engineer agreed. "But look at these photos. They're not satellite imagery. They're not long-range photography. Someone was there." Gorshkov lit another cigarette. His hand didn't shake, but it was close. The Americans had built the atomic bomb while the Soviets thought it was impossible. They'd landed on the moon while Soviet rockets exploded on the pad. They'd created computers that fit in rooms when Soviet machines filled buildings. But this was different. This wasn't technology. This was audacity. "Find out how," Gorshkov said quietly, "and find out where they're going next." Nobody mentioned that if American submarines were already inside Soviet harbors, next was already too late. The countermeasures started in May 1974. New hydrophone arrays, advanced sonar buoys, patrol schedules randomized, attack submarines stationed at harbor entrances. The Soviets threw everything at the problem. They caught nothing. What they didn't understand was that American submarines weren't avoiding detection. They were managing it. Commander Thomas Brooks sat in the control room of the USS Parche, watching Soviet patrol boats pass 200 yards overhead. His submarine was sitting on the bottom of Vladivostok Harbor. She'd been there for 6 hours. "Con, sonar. Contact Sierra 7 is turning toward us." Brooks checked the navigation plot. The Soviet frigate was running a search pattern. Active sonar. They were looking hard. "Time to next ping?" 30 seconds, sir." Brooks glanced at his executive officer. "How's our acoustic signature?" "Dead quiet, Skipper. Reactor at minimum. All non-essential systems secured. We're a hole in the water." The Soviet sonar pinged. The sound reverberated through the hull. Nobody breathed. The American submarines had learned something the Soviets never figured out. You don't hide from sonar by being invisible. You hide by being boring. The ocean floor is full of wrecks, rocks, thermal layers, biological noise. A submarine sitting perfectly still looks like geology. It returns a sonar echo, sure, but the echo looks like every other rock on the bottom. Soviet sonar operators were trained to find moving targets, fast attack submarines, intercontinental missile boats, things that tried to run. They weren't trained to notice that one particular rock had appeared 3 days ago and didn't exist on last month's charts. The frigate's sonar pinged twice more. Then it moved on. Brooks waited 15 minutes, then 30, then an hour. "Con, photography. We've got clear shots of all moorings. Mission complete." Brooks nodded slowly. "Helm, prepare to get underway. Dead slow. Minimal wake." The Parche lifted off the bottom like a ghost. 6 hours later, she was back in international waters. The Soviets never knew she'd been there. By 1975, Soviet naval intelligence had a working theory. They were wrong, but it was elegant. Captain First Rank Victor Digolo presented it to the main naval staff with confidence. "The Americans have developed a new class of midget submarine, small, electric-powered, silent, deployed from larger submarines outside our waters." The theory explained everything: how they penetrated harbor defenses, how they avoided sonar, how they escaped without detection. It was also complete fiction. But the Soviets committed. They redesigned harbor nets for smaller contacts. They recalibrated sonar for mini-sub signatures. They trained attack submarines to hunt tiny electric boats. They spent 18 months preparing for a threat that didn't exist. Meanwhile, the Americans kept doing exactly what they'd been doing. Full-size nuclear submarines, sitting on harbor floors, photographing, recording, mapping. The intelligence haul was staggering. Every Soviet submarine produced after 1970 was photographed before it left the shipyard. Every acoustic signature was recorded. Every patrol route was mapped. The NSA knew Soviet submarine schedules better than some Soviet commanders did. And then there was the cable tap. Operation Ivy Bells, the crown jewel. In October 1971, the USS Halibut had attached a recording device to a Soviet communications cable in the Sea of Okhotsk. A sophisticated pod that captured everything flowing through the line. Encrypted fleet orders, submarine positions, nuclear launch protocols. The pod was recovered and replaced every few months by specially equipped submarines. For 5 years, the Americans read Soviet naval communications in real time. 5 years. The Soviets discovered the tap in 1981. A Navy diver doing routine maintenance found the American device. When they pulled it up, the engineers in Moscow couldn't believe what they were looking at. The sophistication, the audacity, the sheer balls required to plant it. One engineer summed it up perfectly. "They were in our waters, on our cable, for 5 years, and we never knew. The Cold War's greatest intelligence operation had been hiding in plain sight, on the ocean floor, in Soviet harbors, while patrol boats sailed overhead. January 1981, a sealed conference room in the Soviet Ministry of Defense. The cable tap sat on the table like an accusation. 6 feet long, titanium housing, nuclear-powered, sophisticated enough to capture, store, and transmit encrypted communications without disrupting the signal flow. American engineering at its finest. And it had been attached to a Soviet military communications cable. Underwater. In Soviet territorial waters. For nearly a decade. Fleet Admiral Nikolai Amelko stared at it with the expression of a man watching his career end. What did they hear? The GRU officer didn't sugarcoat it. Everything, Comrade Admiral. Fleet movements, submarine patrol routes, training schedules, commander communications, launch procedures. For how long? We're not certain. The device was replaced multiple times. We estimate 5 to 7 years of continuous collection. The room went silent. 7 years. Every submarine deployment, every war game, every tactical discussion. The Americans had heard it all. They knew Soviet doctrine better than some Soviet admirals. They'd mapped every weakness, documented every procedure, recorded every command frequency. How many operations did they conduct? Amelko's voice was barely a whisper. The intelligence officer opened a thick folder. Based on anomaly analysis and retroactive sonar log review, We estimate over 200 penetrations of Soviet territorial waters between 1969 and 1980. 200. Minimum? That's only what we can confirm. The actual number is likely higher. Someone in the room cursed softly. Another officer spoke up. How did we miss this? We have the largest submarine fleet in the world, the most sophisticated harbor defenses. We were looking for attacks, the GRU officer interrupted. For threats, for aggression. We assumed American submarines would operate like Soviet submarines, stay outside territorial waters, maintain standoff distances, follow doctrine. He gestured at the cable tap. They weren't following doctrine. They were rewriting it. The devastation wasn't measured in ships sunk or submarines destroyed. It was measured in obsolescence. Every Soviet submarine built between 1970 and 1981 was compromised. The Americans had photographed them under construction, recorded their acoustic signatures, mapped their patrol routes, documented their communications procedures. The entire Soviet submarine fleet was tactically naked. Admiral Amelko ordered an immediate review. Naval architects pulled blueprints. Acoustic engineers analyzed recordings. Intelligence officers reconstructed what the Americans knew. The answer: everything. They knew which Soviet submarines had propeller defects that created unique acoustic signatures. They knew which commanders preferred which patrol routes. They knew the exact electromagnetic signature of every Soviet submarine class. They knew diving depths, operating procedures, even emergency protocols. In a shooting war, Soviet submarines wouldn't be fighting an enemy. They'd be fighting an opponent who'd studied them for a decade. The economic impact was catastrophic. 12 submarine classes had to be redesigned, acoustic profiles changed, communications systems replaced, operating procedures rewritten. The cost ran into billions of rubles the Soviet economy didn't have. And for what? To reach parity with where they thought they'd been 10 years ago. The Americans had poisoned the well. Every Soviet advancement between 1970 and 1981 was suspect. Every tactical doctrine was compromised. Every training exercise had been observed. One Soviet submarine commander said it best in a classified debrief. They turned our greatest strength into our greatest weakness. We built more submarines than anyone, and the Americans studied every single one. The psychological damage ran deeper. Soviet submariners knew that American submarines had penetrated their harbors, sat on their ocean floors, photographed their boats, while they slept in bunks 200 yards away. The invincibility myth, the idea that Soviet territorial waters were impregnable, died in that conference room. The Cold War was full of intelligence victories. But this one was different. This one proved that courage and engineering could beat numbers and doctrine. Every single time. August 1991. The Soviet Union had 3 weeks left to exist. The final accounting was brutal. Between 1969 and 1981, American submarines conducted over 200 confirmed penetrations of Soviet territorial waters. They photographed 47 different Soviet naval facilities. They mapped acoustic signatures of 187 Soviet submarines. They tapped underwater communications cables in 3 different locations. The Soviets detected exactly 0 of these operations in real time. 0. When the Gulf War came in 1991, the fruits of Holystone became visible. American submarines operated with complete confidence in their acoustic superiority. They knew Soviet exported submarine technology inside and out. Iraqi submarines stayed in port. They knew what would happen if they left. The kill ratio never materialized because there was no contest. Soviet submarine doctrine, built on numerical superiority and defensive positioning, had been systematically dismantled by a few dozen American boats willing to do the impossible. The systemic failure was philosophical. The Soviets built submarines to control territory. The Americans built submarines to gather intelligence. The Soviets relied on defensive networks. The Americans relied on aggressive reconnaissance. The Soviets thought their harbors were sanctuaries. The Americans proved that no place was safe. Most devastatingly, the Soviets spent billions on submarines the Americans had already cataloged, studied, and figured out how to kill. They lost the war before it started. By the time Moscow discovered the cable taps in 1981, the damage was permanent. The intelligence windfall had shaped American naval doctrine for a decade. It had revealed every Soviet submarine weakness. It had proven that audacity beats caution. The Cold War's most important lesson wasn't taught in a textbook. It was taught 300 feet underwater, in enemy harbors, by crews who sat absolutely still while patrol boats hunted above them. The Soviets built an empire of submarines. The Americans photographed every single one. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, among the ashes was a simple truth. You can't win a war when your enemy has been living in your house for 20 years, taking pictures.